Okay, let's see how many people we have here. We have 14, it's pretty decent number. Okay, let's get started. So firstly, please let me and another facilitator, Derrick, introduce ourselves. My name is Yufan Zhang. I'm a postdoc, extension associate from Texas A&M AgriLife Dallas Center. My research focuses on urban stormwater management, erosion sediment control, and green stormwater infrastructure. And Derrick, you want to introduce yourself?
Okay, thank you. My name is Derrick Allotey, and I'm also at McGeHee University at the Bioresource Engineering Department. My research is about looking at how sustainable we can, how to assess the sustainability of agri-food processing in terms of looking at the economics, the environmental, and the product quality, as well as the trade-offs that are associated with all these dimensions. Thank you.
Thank you, Derrick. Thank you for coming, all the audience, and also I want to say thank you to all the panel members for accepting the invitation, make this awesome webinar happen. So from here, let's introduce our panel members. Derrick, you want to go first?
Yeah, so I want to okay, so one of our panel members is Dr. Sushant, and he's an assistant professor at South Dakota State University, and his research is into water resource engineering and hydroinformatics. And then he looks at advancing the understanding and the physical representation of nutrients, fates, and transport. And he's also very keen in exploring how interactions between climate and land management operations impact water quantity and quality. And his passion for working on water resources, that is mainly water quality, is driven by the idea of resolving water issues and um, having to predict some chaos in the ecosystem. And he's a problem solver and likes to work in things related to water sustainability. Thank you.
Okay, so let me introduce Dr. Ryan McGeHee. He's an assistant professor in agricultural and biosystems engineering at Iowa State University. His research interests center on providing reliable, actionable information on how to best manage the Earth's natural resources. He does this through the development and validation of computational models. He develops new model components and improves existing ones using real-world data to ensure that they are operating as intended. Okay, so today the webinar will be what's that?
Oh, don't worry, it's fine. It's from my end, sorry.
Okay. So in this webinar, we will ask questions.
Oh, you've not introduced Dr. Dvorak. I think you should.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
okay,
Derrick,
sure.
go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah. So Dr. Dvorak is also an associate professor and the director of the undergraduate studies in biosystems and agricultural engineering. And his research is into intelligent control systems and specifically applications in solar power for off-grid agriculture management and safety of automated ground vehicles. And he's most active in the information technology, sensors and controls, the technical committee, and also interacts with several machine systems committees. So thank you and welcome, Dr. Dvorak.
So in this webinar, we will ask questions to our panel members, and we will let you know who is going to answer the question. And during the session, for the audience, feel free to drop off your questions in the chat box. And if time allowed it, at the end of the webinar, we will have an open discussion and you can unmute yourself and talk at that time. So now let's get started. So Derrick, you want to go ahead and ask the first question to all the panel members?
Yep. So thank you all for coming. And first question, we want to just set the base for the conversation. So we want to throw these questions to all the panel members. And the question is, in your own understanding and in your own experience, do you think large language models, that is LLMs, has come to stay across all sectors, specifically in agricultural engineering? So we would start off from Dr. Dvorak, then Dr. Sushant, then Dr. Ryan. Thank you.
So I would just briefly start by saying, yes, they're a fundamental technology. It might not look exactly like what we are currently using with the online chatbots, but it's probably going to be similar to the coming of electricity or computers. I mean, it's a fundamental idea that people have come up with. We can use them in lots of different places. We'll find better and different ways to use them. Of course, just like computers and electric power, it's not the solution to everything. There are some places where it works really well and some places where it just doesn't make any sense to do it at all, but it is a fundamental technology.
So I would echo a little bit similar what Joe just said, that I do believe LLMs have started to penetrate across all the sectors. Agriculture is getting a lot of momentum lately. Engineering, healthcare, education, finance. Most of you are young professionals. You know that it is really percolating down into your education skills as well. So, but we have to think here where exactly this thing is going to make a huge impact, and where would you start looking into the necessary impact of these LLMs. To me personally, I feel like summarizing, you cannot anticipate LLMs to generate standards for you, where I feel like it would be adding a lot of value in summarizing information, generating an insights based on automatic routine task or some sort of decision making. It's a path forward. It has not, and I do not see it will conquer all the sectors and it will dominate over them. Human will still be an integral part of that, but there will be a force of LLMs in future.
Thank you so much for that submission. Dr. McGeHee?
Short answer, yes. And I would point to just look at what you've seen in terms of their improvement since the first GPT was released. What they were capable of the first year, what they're capable of now. The trend is definitely towards ever increasing use. So I'm a resounding yes.
Okay, thank you so much for setting the baseline and emphasizing the importance of LLMs in agricultural engineering. And before I hand it over to Yufan, I would like to say that the participants can just put in their questions. If you have any questions, you can put it in the chat room and we would ask them for you. So over to you, Yufan.
Okay, thank you, Derrick. The second question goes to Dr. Dvorak. What are your experiences with standards development?
So before I was actually a professor, I worked at Charles Machine Works designing trenchers, ditch witch trenchers. And so I was a machinery design engineer working on the electric control systems. And of course, there's lots of standards involved there. And some of them are from Europe. Others are noise related. Some of them are electric component related. Other times it was just the fact that the electronics integrated with some part of the engine. And so I had that experience of having to work with standards and use them to do my design. At that time, I was a relatively, new engineer, so I wasn't directly involved with designing new standards. But I did a lot of that implementation, looking up standards. I will say, through my involvement with ASABE, of course, we were on committees and we all have to vote on those standards from time to time. So since then, that's been one of my main areas of being involved, but not in the actual development of new standards.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you, Dr. Dvorak. Derrick, I'll hand over to you and let's go to the third question.
Okay, thank you so much for, at least now we've spoken about LLMs, we've spoken about standards. So I would move on to Dr. Sushant, and the question here is, what could be some of the limitations, since we're talking about trying to integrate LLMs in standard development? What could be some limitations of LLMs in developing standards, especially for a new area of research or a new subfield of engineering, agricultural engineering?
I think it's a great question, and this question should always be thought before you start using LLMs. This is a word of caution to all the listeners I'm suggesting. Why I am suggesting so, I could think of 2 or 3 different points. One, domain-specific knowledge. Think about this as a model. It is simulating something based on training on certain data sets. But if you are talking about standards, you are talking about a highly specialized sections, right? So if you are not having a data set where you have a highly researched to train your model, I think there will be a lack of domain-specific knowledge in your LLM. So that's one. Number 2, I would see that even if it is generating few stuff on existing databases, it is very difficult to validate or to check the credibility of LLMs. The common term that you might have come across the recent articles is hallucinations of LLMs. So that is something need to be considered. The third is sometimes you really get a very unique aspect coming from a prompt that you have written, and suddenly LLM is giving you a new thing, which I think that's where the human aspect comes in, that you need to make that kind of a judgment, whether it is making ethical and cultural value there or not, because LLM can generate anything based on the data that they are being trained on. And moreover, as Ryan said, it is evolving very fast. So we have to be very careful in the delays in the data inclusion, real-time integration. So I think these are some of the limitations that I could see in the research while using LLMs.
Okay, so I would want to, okay, yeah.
Sushant makes a good point about LLM novelty, and I would only add one thing. Not all LLMs are created equal, and the design of them is going to be very important to consider whenever you're thinking about developing a standard and into their limitations. Some of these, they update on a daily basis with new information that was generated yesterday and put out on the web today or something like that. And some of these, they have quite a substantial lag time in their development. Now, maybe they all change in the future, and I suspect they'll all gravitate towards near real-time builds and where they're updated with very recent information, but not all of them do that. And that's just a very important point I would make about any kind of thing. And that goes for all data sets as well. So Sushant brought up that some of these are very specialized data sets that maybe not all of these LLMs have access to. Well, obviously, that's going to be a huge implication on whether they perform well there or not.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for your learning. That is very keen to look at the data updates and also to be careful of the domain you're using and have a way to validate or to verify the performance of your LLMs during standards. Thank you so much. I'll move on to Yufan.
Yeah, so before I ask next question, I just want to let all the panel members know, like, even though we design a question for a certain member, but for the other members, if you feel like you want to contribute something, just feel free to unmute yourself and chime in. Let's move on the next question. So this question is designed for Dr. McGeHee. What processes in the standards and technical development do you think large language model can help potentially simplify?
I don't have a lot of experience in standards development myself. I have only been a part of one standard development, which was as a external reviewer or a letter of endorsement, really, backing Dr. Kendall Zhang's reference ET and potential ET. That's evapotranspiration for people outside my domain. Sorry, I forget that sometimes, but so for potential and reference evapotranspiration, and this is an effort that's moving forward both in ASCE and ASABE at the same time, potentially completely different processes. So from my one limited experience with standards development, I see a real benefit of LLMs in trying to figure out what is common between different societies even. So you have ASABE that may have one process, and then you have ASCE, the Civil Engineering Society, that may be a completely different process. LLMs can help us figure out what's in common between those two, what is different between those two, because those documents are published and available online. Now, again, you have to have access to those documents for these LLMs to be able to read and understand them. But I think potentially they simplify the process significantly when we're talking about breadth and we're trying to integrate multiple different societies at the same time. Potentially that is a great benefit of LLMs. Where I think they struggle is where we've been pointing out recently, or in the last question, was depth. Can they handle the novelty and the very specific nature of different topics? That's yet to be seen. And I would feel a little uncomfortable commenting on whether they can do that or not. I've seen some examples of success and some examples of failure in my testing of these systems, but I think that's probably the experience of many.
Yeah, I agree. I think across different societies, we do have some overlap or differences between different society in this standards and technical development. We should take advantage of the large language model, but like you said, sometimes maybe it's not accurate. We have to double check and make sure we use it wisely.
So I guess I'll add on a couple things. One's closely related, and just the LLMs are quite good at brainstorming. So if you want to think of, hey, what's 5 different ways that I could potentially, describe the criteria that I'm going to use, maybe there's different ways to measure it, and it might be able to brainstorm a few of them that you hadn't thought of before, because it has, it's read a whole lot of different things and it's experienced. You can throw those in. So brainstorming is really nice. And that's one of those things that I think would be great for any level of the standards development as you're looking at things. The other one, so those of you that have been involved with Meetings Council and been planning next ASB meeting, you'll know that I created a tool. It's very closely related to LLMs, but it reads the abstracts of everybody's presentation, and then it creates a vector that encodes its similarity with all other and then you can compare those to all other presentations, and you can determine how similar and the topics of each presentation are. And we've been using that in part of the organization for AIMS, that we can hopefully not have as many just outlier presentations in all of our meetings. But part of that, what's really interesting is that's a standard process. Those models, they're not generative models, but they are large language models. They just give topic meanings instead of generate new text that describes something. And those are really good. They're used in RAG, so retrieval augmented generative systems, where you're trying to pull data out of a database and give it to the LLM so that it's directed. So if you want to write about a certain topic, some LLMs will go and pull a document and read through that document and then use that as it's writing. What's exciting, I mean, you could use that and have it, looking at your standard. You could do something like that where you're using Notion and you're talking to your standard, or Notebook LM from Google. That's a really good one to like look at a standard, and it uses RAG to pull those pieces. The other thing is, if you can get a large corpus of all of the different standards, it would be really helpful to search against it. One of the things that I noticed is that, as a design engineer, I would pull things from one standard and it would reference another standard. And, the aerospace people had designed a really good, standard that described how to test a button. And so we would reference that one instead of reinventing it. And sometimes, being able to see what other people have done might be something where, hey, that aerospace standard doesn't quite apply. Maybe we just need to rewrite it similarly and maybe reference it. Or it could be that, that's a great standard. We ought to just use it as is and pull it in. And so these kind of tools, it's amazing the things that you can get from LLMs that aren't generative. And you can do that kind of thing where you can search. I mean, there's no way every single standard. I mean, there's just too many of them by the time you get across SAE and all the different governmental standards. So having that ability to search through all the standards is really powerful, and it will identify paragraphs that relate to very specific topics. So I think that's an exciting technique, and I think that's something that we should probably see a lot more of, so that we can have standards that are tighter and don't conflict with each other. So thank you.
Yeah, if I can echo something Joe was saying, he said multiple times search. That is the single biggest improvement I've seen in LLM capability since they were launched. So everybody had been using them for summarization. That will improve as they continue to grow the memory allowed for each person's session, and how much caching is allowed of prior responses, of what all is out there in the global data set that these LLMs can access. But aside from those, search capabilities have drastically improved. And increasingly, I see users of LLMs using them for search as opposed to traditional search algorithms and approaches. So just mimicking what Joe was saying there and trying to highlight that I think is really important.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Sushant, yeah.
Sorry, Derrick. To give you an overview of how the ASABE standards work is, besides the technical aspect, there is a lot of logistical aspect in standard development, starting from requests to make changes or to introduce new standards. It is a huge trail of paperwork that either ASABE headquarter personnel does, or otherwise whosoever is taking the lead, the person in charge is doing that sort of work. We are talking about a lot of searches and cache memories that LLMs, the limitation, challenges, opportunities about those stuff. But the magic power I personally see, and we should definitely try to involve LLMs, is drafting the initial documents, synthesizing the comments that we usually receive after the first round of review from the internal committee. So that's where I personally feel like bringing in all those synthesis together, having that sort of harmonization, continuously updating with respect to the new comments that you receive. That's, I personally feel like, where the ASABE standard process can really get benefited from. We have a huge waiting time from first draft to the approval to get approved by the upper committees. So we have committee structures, which I will not get into in this talk, but I think that will really streamline the process and will save us a lot of time, and we can get the final product sooner rather than later, and more efficient product rather.
Thank you so much. I think there was a question Thank you so much for the submission on how we can simplify it. There was a question in the chat. I think I will direct that to Dr. Dvorak. It says, can you clarify what makes up a data set? So I think you've been mentioning with the previous questions, I think we had a lot about data sets and the data being updated. So what makes a data set to be trained, to be used to train an LLM model or used to apply an LLM in making a good standard? So I'll direct that to Dr. Dvorak. Thank you.
So, I mean, if you're talking about in general a data set, there are the large language models, basically, there's one of them that they just scraped the entire web, everything that they could find publicly posted anywhere just got recorded. And you might have seen some of these tools a long time ago, like you could actually go to Web Archive and stuff like that, and it would, because it was constantly recording all of them. Well, a lot of those are hosted on some of these companies that are now building all the LLMs, and so they have these big sets of data. They also, sometimes they'll use that. And how you would train an LLM is it's basically the next word predictor. So, you know, it's an accident that it generates thoughts. They started where, if you think about your text messaging, where it predicts the next word you're going to say and it suggests it for you. What they basically found out was accidentally you just kept hitting next, next, next. And it turned out if the model was large enough, it would actually generate, you know, reasonable thoughts. And it kind of surprised them. And they thought, let's train it with some more data, and then let's do some post training and have it where we train it to answer questions. So they trained it on a question answer data set where for a given question, it responds directly back with an answer. And so they do this post training to reinforce the model's responses. But the initial thing is just shoving a whole bunch of text, and it tries to guess the word that would show up next in the text. And they just run that over and over again, reinforcement learning. And some of those data sets, they'll use like the whole corpus of everything that's online. They'll add Wikipedia in there because that's a pretty good, dense information source that's a little bit more reliable than random Facebook posts. And, you know, they'll might have that in there 2 times or 3 times. Certain coding websites, they might have in there 5 or 6 times so that it's exposed to those more. And then that's what they train against. There's a lot of secret sauce in these companies on how many times they include each type of data, or what data gets included and what data gets rejected. And when they're doing that initial, you know, just word prediction. And so that, I mean, there's a lot there, but it is just about any possible data set they can find is what they're training on. Anyone else want to add to that? Okay.
You nailed it, Joe.
Okay, thank you, Yufan. So you can move on. I think there's a question inside. If you can ask that.
Yeah. So there's a question in the chat box for all the panel members. Training large language models require significant training data sets. Standards, the documents themselves are usually copyrighted or have some restrictions on use. Have you seen any movement from standards development bodies that would allow or facilitate using standards as training without violating copyright?
To the best of my knowledge, I haven't seen any movement, but based upon my limited reading, I see that the OpenAI and the Google are actually requesting to have access to all the formal copyrighted material so that whatever they are generating and throwing out to the public is more authenticated. But that's where that hallucination concept comes in. And we need to be careful that what it is throwing out is making a lot of sense or not. The other thing, I read an article a few days back about the open source initiative. Though they are trying to make the source code and everything available, but still there are suite of AI models which are like restricted content that you cannot access to, and there's still a black box there. So per my understanding and whatever information I do have, I see that there is movement, but a snail sort of movement, but with deep search and other models coming in, I think this thing is going to get momentum, and we will see that the legal allegations, the copyrights, and all these things will be well taken care of, maybe in just next 6 months. I'm not sure, but that's the future. That's how the LLMs are moving and evolving.
So I'll just agree that I haven't heard anything specific, but one of the things that's interesting, it's if you copyright your material so that people can't use it, it's like you don't exist and you have no opinion on it in a way, which is interesting. And it's a challenge, because if the LLM doesn't see it and people are using LLMs to search for it, and then they're designing based on, you know, support they're getting from an LLM, and maybe they're using only you know, open access research journals, that kind of thing as well. Making a decision to copyright something is akin to hiding it. I know there's reasons for it historically, because then you would, you know, a person would find it and then they would request it, and you would make sure that the people that needed it would actually be contributing to the writing of the standard. You know, very, very relevant ideas. But if the LLM that's, you know, training and learning about it doesn't see the standard to ever begin with, people are just not going to be aware that it exists. So I think that's an interesting conundrum that we're going to have to figure out as a standard writing body, especially ASABE. Do we want to make them more publicly available, or at least make a longer scope, you know, maybe document publicly available so that the LLM indexes it, and then that maybe it could then turn people to look through our standards when they're actually getting to the design stage.
Okay, Dr. Arian.
I feel the same way that Joe does. I actually think that that applies to all scholarly works these days, and seems to be moving more and more that direction. Open access, open source, open data, open everything. Otherwise, you won't be found and heard and talked about.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much on your submissions on the different ways we can help address all these legal issues, piracy and privacy with LLMs. And I think my next question is very interesting, because Sushant mentioned it, and I think this question also goes to him. The question is, how can we avoid potential hallucinations if LLMs are integrated into standard development? So Sushant, this is the opportunity to just build on what you mentioned earlier.
I'm a great advocate of introducing AI to every workflow, but at the same time, I do respect the place of a human in that loop. So I think that is the first layer where we can introduce humans. Expertise is needed. And that will really help to validate what LLMs is doing. So having human in the loop will help and avoid hallucinations. And the second thing is what we talked in the last question about the copyrighted material, about the validated authoritative data sets that we are going to use. That is actually going to create more trust in what the prompts are generating. And we definitely need the transparency and the citations. Means, as Joe mentioned in his last comment, that if you are not making it open source or something, you cannot validate what you are saying. So it means those kind of stuff, making it open source is essential. And I think that will really help reducing the hallucinations we are talking about here.
And I will respond to Rebecca's question that she posted. So yes, I'm aware of models being developed for greater privacy, at least on the surface. So on the surface, ChatGPT and Grok both, I know, allow you to restrict what data is shared. I do not know beyond those two, because I've not looked very closely at others. But I also know on the server side of things that you cannot prevent sending your prompt to the AI and getting a response. So you are sending that data somewhere. And it just depends on, do you trust the people that are handling your data not to actually do what they say they're doing? So that is the ultimate question. I don't know that anyone can give an answer on that reliably, but
I have put those two I knew, Meta Llama model and Mistral AI model and Google's Pathway language model. These are three I am aware of that really does this sort of thing that Rebecca is asking basically in her question.
I guess
so I
if
think, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, if I could, some of this like talk about all the open source stuff. I feel like, I mean, I'm looking at it from standards development from a private or a business centric side, and so I just I mean, people would be just rolling over dying at all the talk about open source, because if you can imagine, you know, you're I don't know, maybe yeah, all of these, most of the standards that I work on require significant investment from private sources, such as companies sending their employees, investing their time and their resources and their knowledge, and you know, to basically then put that out there freely, both gives their competitors a leg up on whatever they might be doing, but also just ruins their profitability model in many areas, and also upends the current model of how a lot of standards are developed in terms of how we share the cost burden of that development. So I struggle with all of this. Open source will be the only way to go. It may eventually be the only way to go, but maybe we'll be printing our own currency by then too. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. My other thing with the privacy that I struggle with is sometimes the standards we work on are sensitive in nature. Like there could be ones that do with you know, specific health concerns and medical research, or there could be others such as like the right to repair situation. Like if somebody from John Deere is attempting to work on that with somebody from CNH, and that material is then shared openly, and people don't like what they're seeing, and you know, you have the names of those coordinators now publicly available, you know, that could be you know, harassment issue or something you opening people up to. So I guess those are some of my more specific concerns with it, but we shall see.
So
Thank you so much, Rebecca.
I guess I'll add real quick on the, I mean, like I said, I agree. I understand what you're talking about, the whole business model of the standards. And, you know, it's a big thing. Universities had a business model as well with journal articles, and the ASABE, you know, we pay to publish there. People buy subscriptions to there. And then now it's turning out that ASABE journals are going down in standards quite a bit because no one's citing them, because a lot of people around the world just would not, you know, research would not, you know, they're only using the open access things. Their universities aren't buying the licensing. And so there's just there's a tension there, and it's not easy. And I know that's really big in standards. And yes, it is interesting. It'll be interesting what happens if a company develops a standard, but then their competitors open source a separate standard, and then, you know, the open source one, the one that's published, is the one that matters. I mean, maybe you could say ASABE counts. I don't know. That's going to be interesting. It'll be a big legal battle where that goes. Now, on the health side, University of Kentucky actually has a big health unit, you know, where it's by far the largest college that we have in terms of research. And so they actually have self-hosted LLM models within the medical campus, because that medical record stuff, you're right. You have to have a chain directly tied to where those records are. And so where I first started working with some LLMs was talking to these medical people, and they had to self-host because they're not allowed to share the medical records. And a doctor wanted to figure out I want to search for things that are directly tied to patients. So it all has to be hosted here. Now, I think, like you said, there are some companies that have made some promises, but yeah, the ChatGPT and Google, they had to build special data centers where they're more resistant to hacking to meet the legal standards there. So that is something to be in mind. You might be able to use some of the LLMs, but you might need to be considering maybe you want to use a HIPAA compliant server or HIPAA compliant service, even if you're not doing medical, just because that will give you higher guarantee levels. So that is a big concern. Now, I don't know, Rebecca, do you have anything else on the standards? I know it's hard from a company point. I don't know how else we could say it though.
Yeah, I mean, I know that ANSI and ISO are both looking into this. You know, there's been quite a lot of discussion at the last couple of ANSI internet IAF, let's see if I can remember, ANSI ISO forum meetings about LLMs. I don't think anyone has the answer yet. Is the short term. I don't know exactly if what I'm not clear on is what the overall drive or direction will be long term, but I think there is a lot of concern about, you know, these standards, sort of people putting them out there, you know, putting standards that they've maybe individually purchased, putting them out onto non-protected LLMs, and then, you know, once the cat's out of the bag, right? So I think making our documents more secure against that will be one part of it. A lot of what they're doing too is trying to make the standards more friendly to interpretation by computer. You know, I can't remember exactly. ISO has a website. I'll look for it and I can share that in the chat. But you know, they are trying to make standards more digestible electronically, because they recognize the importance of that. But I think, like this, at least this is my impression, and it's a relatively uneducated one, is that so far I don't think anyone has the answer on how to proceed with licensed, you know, for pay standards. And there's a lot of litigation around that right now as well. It's not just about the LLMs.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Awesome conversation. And let's move on to the next question, which is a very interesting question. So we all agree we should consider the large language models to help us to develop the standards, but how should we actually do that? Do you think we should have a standard about how to use large language models to develop other standards? And how do you think the ASABE can help with this? And this question goes to everyone.
I think the best person who could answer this question could be Tui, because he is one of the observing member on the ISO and ASABE initiative on the data side. So he can very well answer that question if he has attended some of the meetings. But to come back to your question, I think Rebecca has also raised very potential questions. The need for the standard is indispensable, and we need that standard, but how that standard will look like, it will be very complicated to set down those boundaries. I would really love to hear what Tui has to say if he has attended ISO meetings, because ASABE is partnering with ISO to work on the problems related to the data, open sources, AI, and all those stuff. So these are my 2 cents where ASABE can, but it is a long shot. Means it's very difficult to convince not potential, but ongoing researchers, senior members, as well as new members, that how these LLMs will shape the standards in future.
I'll allow everyone to talk so that I can say something, but I'm not sure if I have so much to say, but I'll allow our panelists to really chime in first.
Maybe Dr.
Personally, I
Dvorak.
do not. Go ahead. Personally, I don't think that we're far enough along to have a standard of how to use LLMs in developing standards. I think it's too early to, you know, the way I think about it, at least, is that standards generally come after some field has matured or that we've settled some science. I don't think that we have settled science on LLMs yet. I think we have very conflicting, uncertain science. We're not exactly sure how these should be used, and we're going to be learning a lot and making a lot of mistakes going to be doing a few things right, and we'll learn from that. And then it could be translated over into a standard, but I think it's a bit early to discuss actually implementing that.
So I guess I will just add in that, yeah, I think it is a little bit early to have a standard on developing standards. I would think that there are some steps we would probably take. I mean, immediately people should probably be using them for brainstorming. The other thing I would encourage from ASABE standpoint is if there's any way we can create, or maybe this is an ISO ANSI kind of thing, a searchable system, where it's using RAG to identify individual paragraphs that talk about similar topics, whether it's bolt strength or, a certain type of sensor technology, but it's used in a lot of different places in a lot of different industries, but there might be pieces that would be really useful. And if I'm in ag, I have no clue that someone's using it, in a copier in a medical situation. But it turns out they're doing something, and there's a biologically related thing that maybe applies, but we're never going to see it. So that kind of awareness, and the people at John Deere aren't going to have that medical device maker standard, so they will not have read it, they won't have access to it. But it might have some really useful information, which might drive the committee to say, hey, maybe we should buy that standard and have access to it, or request permission to use it, so that we can integrate it. That's going to be one of those things, or if we can create a big database where it's not just keyword searching, but actually topic searching using LLMs, that would be very powerful, I think, for standards development. So you have people writing standards just use it for brainstorming, and as they're looking at different options, I think humans still need to be writing the standards, at least for now. And then two, if we can start as an organization, start working on making our current standards indexable so that we can share them better and more effectively. I think those are the two things that I would see that would be great.
Just to answer Sushant's question, so I've joined a couple of meetings for ISO, but there are currently no discussion on how we could develop such standards. But I believe it's something that the director is open to. And Andres is someone that is really excited about some of these LLMs that we're talking about. So I believe it's something that we would definitely still have discussions around, and maybe take that further to ASABE. And I know many of the things that we work on, they get to also discuss that with ASABE. There's just a lot that we have to get done, most especially around the open source related things as far as ASABE is concerned. I think we are still a little bit behind in that direction. Yeah, that's just what I have to say to that. But I would take that discussion forward as well.
Awesome. Sounds like we still have a long way to go, but at least we are trying so hard. We're thinking about this. And Derrick, you want to ask a question in the chat box?
Yes. Okay, so I think we had one last question regarding the standards, but I would just ask this. I would direct that to Dr. Sushant. It's about how PhD students can focus on communication skills and domain knowledge improvement using these generative AI skills, and how to make them competitive and effective. And I would like to direct this to Dr. Sushant. Yes, thank you.
Derrick, if you don't mind, can you repeat the question? For some reason, the voice was breaking.
Oh, sorry about that. So I was saying that there's a question in the chat box that talks about how students, especially PhD students, can focus on improving their domain knowledge and communication skills using these LLMs and these generative AI, and how to leverage these tools to make them competitive and also effective in their academic area.
So I'll use this opportunity to promote my CPD at AIM. So I will be talking about, and there will be hands-on CPD for 3 hours organized by the Young Professional Community. If you are interested in learning more and doing hands-on, do attend it, provided I am there. So the second thing is before you start using these things, you need to understand how these things work. So if you are aware, it's just like Joe said, that what they are doing, what LLM is doing is generating the next word, right? So that means you have to feed in good information to generate the next word. So your prompts, the kind of information you are asking, you cannot just randomly ask, tell me about the drainage water management or summarize drainage water management. No, be very explicit, like what information are you actually looking for? Ask your LLM in the similar way. You may not get the right answer, but at least that will train you to generate the right prompt. I mean, I do not know how many of you are aware or not. If you are working in a tech college, there is a master's degree for prompt engineering now. There's a MS in prompt engineering. So the right kind of a prompt is very important. The second thing is how these, which I mentioned very early, that how these language models are working is very critical. So the temperature, I do not know what are the levers that you know that how you can use these large language models. So there is a temperature in ChatGPT from 0 to 2 if you are a paid version. So 2 means you will start getting more diverse answers. With 0, you will get something repetitively the same thing. And if you have started using these language models a lot of times, you will start seeing the repetition is happening again and again. That means your prompts are very similar, your training is not done well, and the thing that Ryan mentioned, the cache memory. So these models are not designed to retain a large memory, right? So you cannot just have 20,000 prompts in just one window. So you need to make sure that you're updating. So these are very small and basic things, which we will practice and rehearse during our CPD as well. The most important skill as a student that you can learn is how to write prompts. Your writing is not going anywhere, my friends. You have to agree on that. Means though there are language models, they cannot substitute your effort in writing.
Yeah, but we'll leave. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sushant, for this. I think we all use it to refine our manuscripts. We all use it to get yeah. So we are all prompt engineers in some informal training sort of thing. Yeah, thank you so much. So our last question, which would be to all the panel members. I think we have a few minutes left, so we would say that each member can just touch on it. Is we've spoken about standard development and all that. So what research direction is needed to improve the performance of applying LLMs in standard development, specifically to the agricultural and the biological engineering context? Yeah, thank you.
When we say research, I think this is a very interdisciplinary topic. We first need to accept that this is something ag and biological engineers will take a long time to understand the back end of these large language models, the architect of the design on which these models were built. So when we say research, as I said, a hardcore interdisciplinary research is required, where a computer scientist and a hydrologist is working on building their own large language model or AI model that can answer specific questions. But if you are expecting large language model to give you answers of everything, expect the hallucinations, expect the uncertainty, where the humans will really make a very important core part. I leave others to add on.
So I guess to add on to that really quickly, I just don't see AI, they're not going to write a standard. We're not going to go, write me a standard on fertilizer placement efficiency and give me metrics. And we have experience in the world. We understand there's issues. I could think of lots of interesting standards to write, but it's whenever there's and usually it's a company that needs to have some kind of coordination with their other people in that same industry that they are sometimes collaborating with, sometimes competing with, and a standard, whether it's the 3-point hitch and things like that we have done for a long time in agriculture, we needed to have some type of standard interface, and it was great to discuss it, but it's not something that just falls from the sky that we decide we need to do and write. It's actually, there's a human problem. There's been a collaboration, coordination problem, and we get together, we start discussing it. Lots of really boring committee meetings. And then okay, we need to start writing a standard now. Yes. Okay. This is where you use the LLM. I kind of think of LLMs. I mean, they're, and this is where the PhD still has a lot of value. And that's LLM, maybe kind of like a new intern. Maybe eventually we'll get to where they can be really specialized on certain topics, and they've been embedded in a company long enough to maybe have some of those negotiations on what we need in a standard, but I don't see that anytime soon. They're more like an intern. They have a lot of broad knowledge. They're great to throw out really random, crazy ideas. Sometimes if you give an intern, to research this, they'll find some really cool ideas that you hadn't thought about. Other times they, end up with something that's not very good. Sometimes they grab things off of Wikipedia that they really shouldn't have, and they weren't accurate. They grabbed off a forum. And so, it's the same thing. It's do you trust your intern to write your, something that's very important? Usually no, the managers look over it and double check it. And that's where the PhD piece, going to that same question, that what's your value? Well, for all of us, I mean, I think ASABE and biosystems engineers are in an excellent position because we aren't super focused on one little technique. We are broad. We look at huge systems and how we integrate with them. And for us, the LLM maybe can handle some of those small little pieces, but answering the question of how do we integrate that, that's something we have as a discipline. And it's something that people that work on standards, you have to have that kind of broad understanding so that you know what to write. So anyhow, I don't know if there's any specific research going on that would have that happen. Like I said, I think it's something that will happen as we continue to work with them.
Okay.
If I were giving my final thoughts on all of this too, not really answering the question, I think about things in terms of my mission here, which is to provide reliable information. And I would say that AI in general, LLMs, don't provide reliable information. They do every, 1 out of 3, 1 out of 2 times that I ask it difficult questions, come up with something really awesome. And especially if you're staying on the cutting edge and using the best tools as they come out, I think you're going to see that fraction increase. But the reliability concern is always going to be there. It's going to get minimized over time as we go from, right now these things are being trained with essentially a $6 billion investment in a GPU cluster. And maybe the next generation will be a $20 billion or a $60 billion investment in GPU clusters, right? And they will get another 9 added on the reliability scale. If they're 90% accurate, going to 99% accurate, but there's still going to be that 1% there. The only way you're going to get a good sense of where they're reliable and not, and it's going to vary highly from one field to another, is by experimenting. You have to try it. And I would say try it on multiple different ones if you have access. I'm hoping that the future of this technology will stay open to a lot of people widely. I'm not sure that it will, because as you go up on that scale of the cost of a GPU cluster, I think these companies have to charge more. So I don't know that it will be available for everyone to be able to test equally like PhD students, as some of people are asking, right? Will universities step in and do like site licensing and say, we want all of our students to have access to a really great LLM? I don't know the answer to that. I hope it's a yes, because I do think these things are going to get better, and they were only able to answer reliably maybe 20 or 30% of the hard questions that I asked initially. And I would say it's climbed maybe to 40 or 45% now, but it's not 100%. It's not even close yet. So Is it getting there? Yeah, I think so. And especially in places that are well researched, lots of open source data, they're going to do better. And especially the models that, and I'm trying to avoid specific names, but the ones that have larger memory caching, those are going to perform better in general. They'll keep track of your conversation better. So all of those things are factors, and I just wanted to bring out those points as my final thought on this.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Ryan, Dr. Dvorak, and Dr. Sushant. So I think we just ended in an hour, and it has been an hour of some good conversation about LLMs, standard developments, and how we can identify potential ways to avoid hallucination, and also with the privacy and the legal issues associated with them. We've learned a lot. So I would want to thank you once again to our panel members and also the participants. I want to thank you all for joining in and for also contributing in form of some questions and some form of things you want to get addressed. I would also want to thank Sarah for helping organize this, and thank you all, and I wish you a very good afternoon, and thank you to my able Yufan too for being with us. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a nice afternoon.
Have a nice afternoon. Have a good lunch.